Today we welcome you back in the same spirit of friendship that has joined our two nations since the beginning of the American Republic. Your Majesty, America will never forget.
My distinguished guests, my fellow Americans, this is America's day. This is democracy's day. We celebrate the triumph not of a candidate, but of a cause, the cause of democracy. The people, the will of the people has been heard, and the will of the people has been heeded. We've learned again that democracy is precious, democracy is fragile, and at this hour, my friends, democracy has prevailed.
Restoring our citizenship, restoring the republic, and correcting a lot of the problems that we have today in America. Founded this country on 220 years ago, and I believe that we have enough freedom still kindling in the heart and soul of every American that we can rediscover this country once again and put it back on a constitutional republic. And we can do it in short order. Because you take into consideration that the Constitution was derived from the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Treaty of Peace. And so they have to be seen together. But that's where the principles of sovereignty and the principles that were laid out in the Constitution, which set up the United States government and the U.S. corporation, it was created by the Constitution, but from the sovereignty of we the people. We the people are the sovereigns in the constitutional republic by law. And one existed as a preamble citizen in the sovereign state of Virginia or New York or Pennsylvania. They considered themselves a Virginia citizen, a New York citizen, a Pennsylvania citizen, etc. They never thought of themselves as United States citizens. Prior to the Civil War and prior to 1868, no one ever referred to themselves as a U.S. citizen. Not even if they resided in the District of Columbia. They still considered themselves citizens of Virginia or New York, etc., etc. So it's a rather new concept, only about 130 so years old. But 220 years ago, firmly founded on those documents of American law that I already mentioned, the sovereignty was vested in the people. And the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain at the conclusion of the American Revolution said quite literally that the people shall have the same prerogative as the king. Now, you don't have to be a genius to figure out what that means. If you're a king or a queen or a sovereign, it means there's no superior authority. There's no one you have to answer to except God and natural law and unalienable rights and all that. The natural law, that you do answer to. But there was no other human government or human being. So, prior to the Constitution, there were sovereign states that were free and independent states, quite literally. That's what it said in the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. The states were free and independent, and the people were sovereign within those states. The Constitution was created out of the sovereignty of the people to create this 14th entity, originally, the United States Corporation, which served as both a corporate enterprise. It was carved out of a piece of Virginia and the Virginia Company, in fact. There were two corporations that came here when the country was settled, the New England Corporation in the north and the Virginia Company in the south. And it was out of the Virginia Corporation that the United States Corporation was carved out of. Washington, D.C. was carved out of a prior corporation. It was deeded over and made into a separate jurisdiction in a separate country. So when the Constitution was created, there were then 14 countries here in the United States of America, the 13 colonies and the District of Columbia. And the concept, which is a misconception that most Americans have, is that the Constitution gave you rights. Most people think the Constitution is what gave you rights. That's what they teach in school. They teach you that America started with the Constitution. They barely even talk about the Declaration of Independence anymore. They don't even mention it. They just believe that it started with the government, that the government suddenly is the sovereign power and the people aren't the sovereign power, which isn't true. The Constitution didn't give you any rights. You already had all the rights you could possibly use before the Constitution was created. You had unalienable rights. All the government could possibly give you are civil rights. But what the government can giveth you, the government can taketh away. And so it's not an unalienable right, which is one the government can't give you and can't take away. They're natural law, natural rights, common law. The right to walk, to breathe, to travel, to do commerce. All these derived from the common law. And no government can regulate those. That is a paramount distinction here, very important, between an unalienable right and a civil right. So when was a U.S. citizen created? The U.S. citizen was created by the 14th Amendment in 1868, one of the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War. Now, the Civil War was a pivotal point in American history. And most people believe today, as they're teaching, that Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator and all that, it was all about freeing the slaves. That is what we are taught. The real purpose for the Civil War, the reason it was fought, was over the issue of state sovereignty. That's why the Civil War was fought. It was fought because the South, who had not fared well under this constitutional contract, and the federal government that happened to be in place, and the European powers that were influencing the federal government and the industrial North, were preferential to the industries and the commerce of the North and deferential to the South. And so the South said, hey, we're getting the bad end of the deal here. We want to secede from this union. We want to revoke this contract that we created. The states created the Constitution, remember. They wanted to revoke the contract and secede from the union because it wasn't serving them any longer. And then the federal government and the European powers behind that in the North, of course, crushed the state sovereignty and the secession movement of the South. That was why the Civil War was fought. And from that point to the present time, there has been a continual assault upon the sovereignty of the states and the sovereignty of the citizens. And as time has progressed, more and more and more of the sovereign people have become U.S. citizens. More and more of the responsibilities of the states have been transferred to the federal United States, to that little area, that District of Columbia, that 14th country that was created, that only had jurisdiction within the 63 square miles of the District of Columbia, or an unincorporated territory, or any area that it had a federal area or a federal enclave. Any place there existed United States citizens, in fact. So the Constitution did not give you rights. You had rights prior to the Constitution. It simply restated what rights, the unalienable rights that the sovereign people had. Of the Civil War to the point of Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which I'll talk about when I get into the economic section, there was a long duration of time between that and the Social Security Act. When the 14th Amendment was passed, it was passed for the newly freed black slaves. Because the country was racially divided during the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, and since the Civil War, around the issue of whether or not blacks were going to be given full sovereign rights. Citizenship was determined by the states, not by the federal government. Every state had and still has the power to naturalize citizens directly through the superior courts. Ex parte Frank Knowles here is the Supreme Court precedent for that. And in the state constitutions, it delineated what a citizen was. A citizen was a white male, basically, in most of the states. And so there were great debates about whether or not the newly freed black slaves were going to be given the unalienable rights of the sovereign people, or whether they were even going to be given freeman status within the states. And because most of the states were unwilling to do that, all of them but two, New York and Pennsylvania, were both willing to grant the newly freed black slaves full sovereign status. The federal government and the European powers behind it saw this as an opportunity to wrestle the sovereignty away from the states and the citizens, and saw the 14th Amendment as an opportunity to begin the long road of encroachment, and thus granted United States citizenship to the newly freed black slaves. and granted them civil rights and protection of the federal government. But again, they got civil rights, not unalienable rights. They know they got a bad deal. They didn't get the unalienable rights, they just got civil rights. There were two parts of the 14th Amendment. The first part was a person is a legal fiction. A U.S. citizen is a legal fiction like a corporation or a trust is. It's just created. It doesn't represent, it doesn't mean an actual live individual human being. That's not the person that they're talking about in the 14th Amendment. But they created a U.S. citizen, a fictitious citizen. The U.S. citizen isn't a citizen at all. Because a corporation can't have citizens. A corporation can only have franchisees. That's why they call it the Franchise Tax Board here in California. Because if you're a U.S. citizen or a resident, you're a franchisee of the state of California corporation. And thus you're subject to the income tax, and you have to give back to the corporation that gave you something. And what the newly freed black slaves and U.S. citizens had to give back in order to get protection and so-called benefits from the federal government was they had to give up their unalienable rights. In fact, they had to become property of the federal government. The birth certificate was created for the children of the newly freed black slaves. Anybody here got a birth certificate still? You're a black slave. They were created for the black slaves. It enrolled the black slaves' children as property of the federal United States. When you get a birth certificate, you become property of the federal United States. Your birth certificate is transferred to the Bureau of Census, to the Department of Commerce. You are enrolled as a beneficiary of the Federal Reserve System, and you become obligated to the national and federal debts. That's one of the foundational instruments. One of the adhesion contracts, we call them. And someone existed as a preamble citizen in the sovereign state of Virginia or New York or Pennsylvania. They considered themselves a Virginia citizen, a New York citizen, a Pennsylvania citizen, etc. They never thought of themselves as United States citizens. Prior to the Civil War and prior to 1868, no one ever referred to themselves as a U.S. citizen. Not even if they resided in the District of Columbia. They still considered themselves citizens of Virginia or New York, etc., etc. So it's a rather new concept, only about 130 so years old. But 220 years ago, firmly founded on those documents of American law that I already mentioned, the sovereignty was vested in the people. And the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain at the conclusion of the American Revolution said quite literally that the people shall have the same prerogative as the king.
Okay? Powers remaining in the states. People of a state are entitled to all rights which formerly belonged to the king by his prerogative. The king, in that digest, law summary book, you have to go look it up like I'm doing to see the whole thing in complete detail. And here's what it says. Through the medium of their legislature,
through the legislator,
exercise all the powers.
See?
So, we as Moorish Americans that are part of the United States of America Republic understand that it's about state. And other nations and races of people living here in America, when they see that we run our government under the principles of love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice, guess what they want to do? They want to leave the state that they part of, and they want to come and live under your state, under you, because they love and like the way that you run your state, which begins to make your government the most popular government. Understand the 14th Amendment clearly. Anyone born and naturalized here is automatically a citizen here and of the state in which they reside. The United States government has never told our people that we could not form ourselves into an independent nation state at no time. And to align ourselves with the national constitution of the United States of America Republic, we must understand that we're not in line with the United States Constitution because we're not acting as what? National citizens. Because if we were national citizens, we would have what? A state. A state. In this country, the states are sovereign. Plain and simple as that. The states is not an individual person, but a nation of people. This is not hard. This is simple math. I'm giving you the numbers. You do the math. Add it up. Add it up. Stop letting people tell you anything. Add it up. Anything that I demonstrate, that I teach you, is always going to be law and line up with law. Is the key to the whole puzzle. In this country, the states are sovereign. Okay? And the states is the people. That's the definition of the state. Okay. And the state must control. A lot of our people are speaking with nonsense instead of common sense. If you're a flesh and blood individual, there's no way that you can interact in commerce with artificial entities. That means you gotta have a spacesuit when you go in space. You gotta have scuba diving gear to go underwater and stay underwater for long periods of time, or you'll drown. Going out of space with no spacesuit, you're gonna suffocate. Okay, you're trying to interact in commerce with artificial entities. You can't do that. You gotta have your spacesuit. Your spacesuit is your artificial entity created to interact with those other artificial entities. It's real simple. Okay? So it comes on their behalf, and it got certain privileges and immunities that the people themselves won't have without this entity. This entity gives them those privileges and immunities and everything else that they want. So all true ownership and property come from the state. Nobody owns nothing. Nobody. People live in a carnal illusion. They be running around here trying to own stuff. You can't own nothing. The Quran is telling you it's only goods and passing objects. The Quran of Muhammad. There's only goods and passing objects. That means you never own nothing. Ever in your life. Do you ever own anything? So our people is chasing what U.S.A.R call carnal illusion. And this will keep us on the bottom. We not understanding. We got to follow what the prophet say. He say, don't own nothing, control everything. Control it, don't own it. If you own it, you got liability here because you the owner. I trust the vast estate express trust any property and anything that we have. Being a nation of people, all our property should be going into this vast estate express trust. Because the trust itself is established for the Moorish American people. So when I pass on and my birth certificate being a bond, the bond don't disintegrate because I pass away. The bond is still worth money. It's floating. And it should, my people, my children should still be able to eat off my bond. If my people as a nation does secure it and put that bond into our trust, my children can still eat off that. They can still get parks built off that. They can still get L's built, bus lines, schools built, you name it, hospitals built, all that. As a nation though, not as no individuals, as a nation, and my children benefit because what? The government that we established for us as a nation of people is creating opportunity. That's what it does. The government is not selfish. It's only if you put selfish individuals in your seats of government that's running it where the corruption comes in at. There is no corrupt government. It's only corrupt people. A government ain't nothing but a corporation formed on paper. Residents, every Moor that's in the Moor side symbol of America right now are residents of the state in which they reside. If they are not a national citizen under this national government, they are residents. They're walking around with state IDs. They're walking around with and driving around with state license plates. Their children are being issued birth certificates by whatever state they reside in. Okay? The Supreme Court has already stated that, guess what? An individual cannot change his nationality at will. It does not work that way. Nationality deals with a state government. And it's a meeting of the minds between the individual seeking nationality or citizenship and the state conferring the nationality or citizenship upon the individual seeking it. It's a contractual agreement between the two. Therefore,
international law, everyone has a right to a nationality. No one should be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality or denied the right to change his nationality. The right founded on this exercise of a genuine and effective link between an individual and a state. The first time this link was acknowledged as the base of citizenship was in the case decided by International Court of Justice, 1955. Bow. International law, right? The legal basis of right to nationality, Article 20, right? Every person has the right to a nationality. Everybody says that. Every person has the right to a nationality of the state. Okay? Despite the fact that it is traditionally accepted that the conferral and recognition of nationality are the matters for each state to decide. Okay? International law, right? In principle, questions of nationality fall within the domestic jurisdiction of each state. Black's Law Dictionary. Nationality. That quality of character which arise from the fact of a person belonging to a nation or state. Nation of people. A state is a nation on international law. Nation or state. These words are interchangeable. Nationality determines the political status of the individual, especially with reference to allegiance, while domicile determines his civil status. So, where do you domicile? The state, not the temple. Where do you domicile at? You go there for service. Where do you domicile? In the state. Bow.
this is breaking it down because they were part of what? A particular social group. Okay? So our people in this country are really refugees. Okay? The only reason that they're not being treated as such, but you remember when the catastrophe happened in Louisiana, George Bush came on TV and said what? He called the people refugees. So now if you listen to this, you'll understand why George Bush called our people refugees. Okay? Because you are people that's being protected by who? By another nation. You can't.
Congress has approved additional financial assistance. So what we want you to know is FEMA's making up for lost time. That's why we're coming to you in the cities and in the churches and libraries of this battered city. And in Lafayette, Houston, Chicago, Dallas, where the refugees have ended up.
Refugees.
Chicago, Dallas, where the refugees have ended up. We're coming to you in the cities and in the churches and libraries of this battered city. And in Lafayette, Houston, Chicago, Dallas, where the refugees.
Refugees. Black people are considered refugees legally. Bow.
Katrina, you were exiled by a hurricane. Fellas, you lost your homes, people that you love. You were even called refugees in your own country. You're not refugees, you're Americans.
I'm a Mo, and got sense enough to know I'm a Mo. And ain't gonna never argue with you that I'm not a Mo. And wouldn't come in your house or come among you and say I'm a Mo if I didn't feel in my heart, in my mind, in my soul that I am.
I'm on what?